So thanks so much for the nice introduction. A couple things before we get going. First, I have a bad cold, which I'm sure you heard during the introduction. I have 3 kids under 7 now, so I'm just like perpetually sick. So I apologize if it sounds like I'm just going to keel over. I'll be fine in like 30 seconds. Second thing is, it's always fun to be back. I had a great 5 years here, and so it's nice coming back for a visit. The third thing is, and Dalton and I were talking about this before, I'm in a department that's mostly economists at this point. It's about 2/3 economists, and so you should definitely feel free to interrupt. I would rather feel like we're getting questions resolved than I'm getting through a talk and you have a bunch of questions that sort of haven't been dealt with. I also know from my econ colleagues that if there's no questions in the first 5 minutes, that's the we'll pass sort of sign. So it's always nice feeling like people are engaged. The final thing, and Dalton asked me to explain this too, so the Rockwell Foundation Research Unit, which is where I have a 20% appointment now, it's a privately funded think tank that focuses especially on social policy in Denmark. And there's special sort of emphasis on highly vulnerable populations, which is why they signed me on. So a lot of the stuff that I do now is using Danish registry data and is working with my Danish colleagues from the Rockwell Foundation. Okay, whoops. So just to give you a basic outline, by the way, we're just going to lose like 1 letter apparently due to the projector. So any other typos that you see in the middle of my slides are also due to the projector. It's not just the ones at the end. So we're going to do sort of 4 things today. The first thing, I'm going to give you some basic definitions around solitary confinement. I think most of us know what it is, but it's good to still be clear. And then give you a little sort of motivation for why we might want to study this more. The second thing I'm going to do is talk about what little we know about the effects of solitary confinement on individuals, on institutions, and also sort of more broadly. These are both going to be pretty brief sections. The third thing we're going to do is talk about the data very quickly, although I'm happy to answer sort of an infinite number of questions about the data. We'll talk about the analytic strategy and then the empirical findings. And then we'll wrap up and I'll talk about a couple sort of next steps that I've been thinking about. Certainly happy to hear any other advice you have or ways that you think I could go with things. No questions at this point, I assume. So definitions and motivations. So who knows what what do people think solitary confinement is? Since there are a large number of graduate students. What do we think solitary confinement is? Oh, come on. Everybody reads the New York Times. So the basic idea is that when inmates are locked in their cells between 22 and 24 hours per day, getting out only for sort of recreation and the occasional shower. So maybe a shower 2 or maybe on the upside 3 times a week if you're lucky. A very brief, still solitary spell outside where you're often confined to like a relatively small space, but it's just moved outside instead of inside. Now, one of the things that's interesting about solitary confinement and why I feel pretty comfortable using registry data to consider this question is that the experience is pretty awful and also extends across almost all contexts. So when I go to Denmark for work, they're pretty happy to let you sort of roam around in prisons, even in sort of the highest security prisons they have. It's very different from the US in that regard. And having seen sort of solitary confinement and supermax wings, both in Denmark and in the United States, and having talked to folks who have been in those types of facilities, it is a strongly, strongly parallel experience. And it's used for 3 basic reasons, and this is sort of consistent across the world too. To punish really specific infractions, to keep the inmate who's actually in solitary confinement safe, and to keep inmates in the general population safe. So if you want to just think about these different types of experiences or type of reasons for placing someone in solitary, punishing specific infractions tends to be either because of something like having a cell phone in the facility. This is a really common occurrence both in the States and in Denmark. For keeping inmates or keeping the inmate themselves in solitary safe, in the U.S. this is more often going to be the case because someone is transgender or someone is in has some sort of ongoing beef with a different gang in the facility. It's essentially someone where there's a high risk of victimization. And then keeping inmates in the general population safe could happen for two reasons. Either there could be a really specific violent incident, so a really, really bad fight essentially where someone was stabbed or there was a weapon used otherwise, where there was a high risk of someone dying or being seriously injured, or somebody could sort of control a gang or some other sort of social network in prisons that led to them being a danger to the general population.
I'm just asking a question, so
sure.
You know we're interested. Are there other options in terms of keeping the inmates safe? Number two reason, in other words, like do some prisons put vulnerable people, transgendered and some other vulnerable person together so they're not solitary, they're not being punished in the sense of solitary, but what are the options there, and does Denmark and the US do it differently?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So every state in the US is going to deal with it differently. Generally, states that have larger systems will have special wings for folks who are seen as vulnerable for some specific sort of reason. For states that tend to have mostly smaller prisons, they'll often be moved into the medical ward. But I would say probably in the average state, 60 to 70% of the folks who are seen as at high risk for being victimized will be placed in administrative segregation for their own protection.
Solitary.
Yep, which is solitary.
What are the percentages across those three regions?
So 1 in 3 can very easily get muddied. So 3 can essentially be sort of a catch-all. I would probably say that it's about 45, 10, 45 would be my sense for the general breakdown. Most folks who are in solitary confinement aren't in for their own protection. Thank you for letting me know that you at least are interested. Any other questions while we're on this? Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question. Is it used across in every prison in the United States, or are there some that don't have that as part of their policy? Or is it relatively ubiquitous?
There may be some states where if you're in a minimum security prison and you were sentenced to solitary confinement on the basis of some infraction, that you would be transferred to a medium security facility to serve that sentence. So I'm certain that there are some lower level security facilities where they wouldn't have the solitary confinement cells.
But among high security, it's kind of...
Okay. Yep. Every maximum security facility would have a large wing of folks who were either in supermax, which would just be continuous lockdown as part of their sentence, like going forward, or would have a large solitary confinement wing more broadly that was for folks who have infractions. So this is, it's very hard to get an estimate of what proportion in a specific type of facility in the U.S. Are in solitary on any given day. But I do have some numbers that I'll show you in a second about sort of the entire population. But yeah, so all prisons, with the possible exception of very, very low-level security facilities, would have some sort of wing for solitary confinement. So in the U.S., just to give you a sense of numbers, about 60,000 inmates are in solitary confinement on any given day. About 300,000 folks are in solitary confinement for at least a 24-hour period at some point over the year. These are actually unique individuals. It's not folks who are getting double counted. Only about 20% are in supermax facilities. I only want to mention that because There are a bunch of published estimates that suggest that the number of folks who are in supermax facilities is actually somewhere between 40 and 60,000. Those are all wrong, but it's hard writing like a one-sentence paper on why everybody else's estimate is wrong. The basic idea is that in the census of correctional facilities, you have two questions that deal with supermax. One is whether it's a supermax facility, and then the second is whether somebody's in a supermax wing. Every facility is characterized by its highest security level, and so any facility that has anybody in a supermax is technically counted as a supermax facility. And so people haven't, when they've generated their estimates, haven't pulled out the folks who are technically in a supermax facility, but who aren't in a supermax wing.
What's
Yeah.
the definition of a supermax?
So supermax is folks who are in solitary confinement as a condition of their sentence, from the day they enter, theoretically, until the day they leave the facility, although most of those folks won't leave the facility at all. So those are folks who are in solitary confinement basically for life, which is where most of the research is in terms of the consequences of solitary confinement. So I think solitary confinement's effects are interesting for a couple of reasons. I think they're interesting for ethical reasons. I think they're interesting for pragmatic reasons. And I also think they're interesting for theoretical reasons. So they're interesting on ethical, or the ethical reasons I think are pretty obvious and are what you see most in sort of popular media, which is that solitary confinement's considered a form of torture. And so the fact that it's used on folks, I think, is ethically problematic in the minds of a lot of folks. There are also really important pragmatic reasons to be interested in the consequences of solitary confinement. So having someone in solitary is incredibly expensive. It costs, depending on the state, anywhere between $80,000 and $100,000 a year to have someone in solitary confinement, which would be anywhere between twice as expensive or 3 times as expensive to about 10 times as expensive as what it would be to have someone in a more traditional sort of facility. So it's incredibly costly. We have some sense that there are these negative mental health effects, but we have no idea if there are other benefits or other costs associated with it. And so that's sort of the part that I'm going to try to focus on today in terms of thinking about where to go. And then there are also theoretical reasons that I think solitary confinement exposure is interesting. So I don't think Matt's here, but if you think about some of Matt Desmond's work, or you think about some of Pat Sharkey's work on exposure to violence, it's interesting to think about the sort of long-lasting consequences of these relatively brief but highly traumatic sorts of episodes. And so I think there's a theoretical reason that we'd want to know about this as well. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So what do we know about the effects of solitary confinement? And I think the short version is not much at all, actually. The main reason that we don't know much at all about the effects of solitary confinement is that until basically the last 2 or 3 years, getting prisons in the US to release the granular level of data that you would need to think about estimating the effects of solitary confinement was just totally off the table. So it's only very recently that we've started to get to the point where you could think about estimating individual level effects here. So we know a couple things. So first, in terms of inmate safety, and this is sort of thinking about inmate safety more broadly, it looks like there's pretty inconsistent effects on violent offending for individuals who experience solitary confinement. And there also look like there are pretty inconsistent effects in terms of the aggregate level of violent incidents that you see in the facility. Now, of course, there's measurement error all over this, right? Like, violent offenses in correctional facilities mean offenses that are violent to the point that somebody has to go to the hospital and you can't ignore the fact that there was a violent incident, or that somebody gets a ticket for a violent incident, right? And so we're not actually measuring the actual rate of violence that's happening. We're measuring sort of how well the institution catches that. Does that make sense? But there's no sort of strong evidence that we see beneficial effects there. Now, for those who are placed in solitary confinement, basically all of the research on the consequences of that focuses on very, very, very long-term exposure, right? So Craig Haney is sort of the person who's pioneered this field, and the vast majority of his work focuses on men who are in supermax facilities who have already been there in excess of 5, 10, 15 years. And so he essentially studies sort of how people's mental health degrades over these intensely long bouts of solitary confinement. But even for relatively short periods in solitary confinement, we see pretty substantial negative effects on mental health. The evidence here varies between anywhere between over about 3 days in solitary confinement, consecutive days in solitary confinement, and over about 7 consecutive days in solitary confinement having long-term mental health effects. But there is some literature that suggests that even pretty short periods in solitary confinement will sort of lead to a accumulation of kind of mental health problems, even after release. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about here, I'm going to get to the research question and it'll be clear exactly where we're going with it, but we've been trying to think about the fact that, so mental health has these large effects on employment outcomes and also has large effects on criminal activity. And so we've been trying to think about whether the effects of solitary confinement could go through negative mental health outcomes and could end up leading to prisoners who are less able to successfully re-enter into society. And so we've been trying to use, essentially, I mean, I think of them as the only two things that criminologists care about, which is earnings and recidivism, but trying to think about how solitary confinement ends up affecting those sorts of things. So our research question here is, and this will be the only thing I try to read, so how does being placed in solitary confinement affect the risk of being convicted of a new crime and cumulative earnings in the 3 years following release from a correctional facility in Denmark? And I think we make sort of two core contributions. The first one is to provide a more direct test of how transformation caused by the incarceration experience actually affects subsequent outcomes. So when you think about how incarceration could affect individuals, it could either affect individuals through stigma or it could affect individuals through transformation. And currently, we have two different types of tests. We have really nice tests, most of which were done by Diva Pager and some of which were done by Bruce Western as well, that are essentially experimentally varying incarceration status and seeing how that affects how employers respond to an applicant. So we have some nice evidence around stigma, and then all the other tests we have are essentially some combination of stigma and transformation, but we don't ever get any direct information on the effect of transformation on how inmates do afterwards. And so I think the thing that's nice about this is no employer, no parole officer, nobody associated with the institutions on the outside will know that somebody's ever been placed in solitary confinement. And so theoretically, the only effects that we should see should actually be due to the transformation that occurs as a result of the solitary confinement. I hope people agree, because that's one of the sort of underpinnings that we're trying to use in terms of the sort of theoretical contribution. And then the other thing that we hope we're bringing to the table is a significantly stronger research design than anything else that's been rolled out in this area. As I said before, getting data out of correctional institutions into the hands of researchers where you could design a really strong test of the effects of solitary confinement has been really difficult. And so we think that this test is actually a lot stronger than any of the other things you'd see, which would basically just be sort of following people who are in solitary confinement for an exceptionally long period of time with no sort of comparison group and very little data beyond sort of what you're able to glean from the interviews. So we're hoping that those are sort of the two kind of core contributions. Any questions about that? Okay, so we're going to use Danish registry data, which I'm happy to talk about in detail if folks have questions. For this study, the thing that's distinctive is that we were actually able to get the Danish Prison and Probation Service to work with us to give us all of their individual level data on all sanctions that inmates got for sort of behavior while they were incarcerated over a 3-year period. So we know both folks who got other disciplinary sanctions, so folks who essentially got a ticket and had some sort of formal punishment, but weren't placed in solitary confinement, and folks who got a ticket, were written up for something, were punished, and were placed in solitary confinement. And so we think we actually have a pretty nice comparison group of folks who committed sufficiently serious offenses that they came to the attention of the prison authorities, and the prison authorities felt compelled to respond, but didn't actually end up in solitary confinement. So as I mentioned, we're focusing on cumulative earnings and the cumulative probability of being convicted of a new crime in the 3 years after release. We've messed around with a whole bunch of other sorts of employment measures and also sort of measures of criminal activity or criminal recidivism. The results are never perfectly consistent across all outcomes, right? As much as we might love for them to be. But the results are highly consistent across these different measures of employment and recidivism. So the basic analytic strategy that we're going to use does two things. So first, we're just going to use fairly basic covariate adjustment and then some matching models. I think even if we had just done that, that would actually be significantly going beyond what the existing research on the consequences of solitary confinement has been able to do. But I think the real sort of strength of the test is we also have a set of models where we use either basic covariate adjustment or matching, and we also limit the sample to this group of folks who had been officially sanctioned for their behavior as well. And so we're thinking about that as a very, very strong research design in this area, even though it's not a proper causal test in the way that I at least would want it to be. We have also done some diff and diff estimates with this, and I'm happy to talk about that later in the Q&A. The results are consistent across those, but we sort of essentially struggled with how many moving pieces the paper had if we did those. Yeah?
Can you use like the old judges, random assignment to judges strategy in terms of random assignment to wardens that are, the most badass versus the softies?
Yeah, so they're pretty much all softies in Denmark. It's like, yeah, it's funny, like the last Danish prison I visited was essentially the equivalent of the hospital for the criminally insane in Denmark, which is the only one where they actually have anything that looks like a supermax facility. And I left and I was just like, I just want this warden to be my mom. Like, I love her so much. So you could, so the thing that would be ideal, and there have been two pieces of information that we haven't been able to get out of prison and probation that we're still trying to hammer away on them. So we should theoretically have information on rotational assignment of guards to wings. And the guards vary sort of tremendously in not only how many tickets they give initially, but in how hard they push for inmates to end up in solitary confinement. And so we ideally would be able to use something like that. We just haven't been able to get that information out of them. The other piece, which is related to another set of papers that I'm working on with these data that we haven't been able to get out of them, is so there are basically 5 folks whose job it is to decide what prison people go to when they're sentenced in Denmark, and so it's rotationally assigned there too. And so theoretically, if we were interested in something like the effective distance from home on sort of how inmates have settled in, and especially on how their families are doing, which is something that we've been trying to think about. If we had information like that, it would be perfect. But they've been really hesitant to release any of that information even as a de-identified just like number that we could use to isolate effects. And I think it's primarily because there are all these concerns about being able to identify folks who are part of sort of the criminal justice apparatus. But yeah, that would be sort of the ideal kind of scenario. Other questions? By the way, I'm very envious. Every time I'm back at OPR, I'm envious that the students actually show up to things. Ours mostly just scowl at me when I try to get them to go to things. So this is probably a function of Noreen being more intimidating than I am. Also, I have to say, I love the big screen because you can actually sort of see these from the very front rows. So I just want to give you a bit of a sense of what sorts of things that we're able to include here as controls, and I've tried to highlight sort of the core things. I mean, I think one of the things that is worth mentioning just in terms of understanding the Danish criminal justice system is this distinction. So in Denmark, you have jails, you have open prisons, and you have closed prisons. Open prisons basically means that people are sort of always on work release or educational release. So whenever you have a justified reason for leaving the institution, you're able to sign yourself out, and you have to come back. But even if you don't, there aren't sort of dramatic consequences. So the only ones that align really closely with what we would think of as being a prison in the US context is a closed prison. The other thing that we do have very high quality information on that's important for our story is recent mental health contact. So what this essentially means is someone who's institutionalized, even very briefly, for some sort of psychiatric episode. And so we're able to adjust for that. We also, in a couple of robustness checks, have made sure that folks who experience solitary confinement aren't sort of devolving more quickly psychologically even before they experience solitary confinement than other folks are. Because I think for me at least, the core concern would be there's a group of folks who respond really poorly to being held in a correctional institution. Even in Denmark, where the average sentence is going to be 60 or 90 days, you'd notice those folks really falling apart pretty quickly. And so the falling apart is actually what leads to the solitary confinement, which then leads to these sort of outcomes down the road. And we don't see any different in inpatient episodes for folks who do and don't experience solitary confinement from the time they enter the facility until the point at which they actually end up in solitary. So we've found that to be pretty encouraging, because in the U.S. system, if someone had some sort of serious mental health episode, the probability that you transition them to a secure mental health facility is pretty low. Mostly that would be dealt with in-house. But in Denmark, if someone had sort of a really severe mental health problem, they would very often be transferred to one of these facilities. And so we found it encouraging that we don't see that. If there are other things that folks think we should maybe be including, I'm happy to chat about those. I mean, I think we thought that this was a pretty exhaustive list of the things that we could come up with. Yeah.
I was wondering, are your total days in solitary in one session, or total times? Okay, sorry, I just didn't see this.
Yep.
And my second one was, if someone has been in solitary confinement once, are they at a higher risk for being in it again? Like, is it, do they select into?
Yeah. So you don't see. So folks who end up in solitary one time are more likely, before adjusting for anything else, to end up in solitary for a second time. But after you adjust for the same sort of factors that we use in the later model, being placed in solitary once is no more likely to lead to a second spell.
Okay. I was wondering if they were punishing that specific person a lot because of the warden question.
Right.
Sort of random.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. So one of the things that we've done, because so you could be concerned about them focusing really specifically on somebody. You could also just be concerned realistically about somebody just being impossible
Yeah.
to deal with, and just making the facility either very unsafe or not able to run in sort of a fairly rigid fashion, which is how I want things to run. And so one of the things that we've done is we've limited the sample a bunch of different ways in terms of the number of times that folks have been in solitary. So we've limited the analysis just to folks who are in once or not in at all. And then we've limited it to folks who are in less than 3 times or not at all. And so that we're not sort of affected by those folks who have cycled through a whole bunch of times. This would actually be, I mean, I think if you were doing a US specific analysis, which is one of the follow-ups we want to do, if you're doing a US specific analysis, that's something that you'd have to be really, really, really intensely worried about, because the sentences are so much longer that the sort of maximum number of times you could end up in solitary confinement is just going to be a lot greater than in the Danish sample, where the average period of confinement in our sample, or the median period of confinement, I think is like 60 days or 75 days or something like that. It's a very short sort of stay. Okay, other questions? Okay, but Denmark and the US are super, super, super different, right? And you're all polite enough to not say that to this point, which I appreciate. But I think one of the things that's pretty interesting is that the Danish closed prisons and the US state prisons actually seem to function in pretty similar ways when it comes to solitary confinement, with one core exception. So the core exception is the average length of stay in solitary confinement in the US is exponentially longer. So if you look down here, this is number of days in solitary confinement in the last 12 months. And so what you see is in Denmark, it's just a tiny number of folks who are in for more than 2 weeks in the last year. But if you look at US, 6% we know with certainty have been in for at least 2 weeks. And the folks in this survey who are in this 2.6%, so the 2.6% there is all the folks who weren't allowed to complete the entire survey because they were in a sufficiently high-level facility that they couldn't trust them to come out of the cell to do the computer-assisted thing. So they just got a one-page paper version. And so, although they won't tell you this in the survey, these are basically all the folks who are in supermax facilities, essentially. And so they're missing. So average duration of exposure to solitary confinement is a lot higher in the US than it is in Denmark. But one of the things that's interesting is the proportion of folks in Danish closed prisons and US prisons who end up being exposed to solitary at any point is pretty similar. So it's 22.5% of folks who are in a Danish prison have been in solitary in the last 12 months, and 18% of folks in US facilities. And so even though the severity of exposure is different, the probability of exposure is pretty similar. Yeah?
So how different are these cells? Are the Danish more spacious? Is there any difference in accommodation in that?
So I think the way I would think about it is the only difference is between how much of a shock solitary should be in Denmark relative to the conditions in the rest of the facility. So in the average sort of Danish medium security prison, folks would have their own rooms, they'd have access to the internet, they'd have access to television, they'd be able to come and go within the facility as they pleased for educational activities or leisure activities. And so the fact that the solitary confinement cells in the US and in Denmark are virtually identical means that it's going to be a more abrupt transition for Danish inmates than it is for US inmates. But yeah, they're incredibly similar. And I'd like to try to, I hate visiting prisons. It's really is an unpleasant place to visit. But I'm totally curious because US solitary confinement cells and all of the Scandinavian countries' solitary confinement cells look very different, and the experience is very similar. So it'd be interesting to go to other places and find out more about that. Okay, so the other concern that it would be reasonable to have is that folks who end up in solitary, as opposed to experiencing other disciplinary infractions, geez Louise, sorry guys. I'm just curious. Yeah. So when you make the font even smaller, it's actually harder to read. Shocking. Sorry about that. And the most depressing part is that it's a tiny little table, so I don't really have an excuse. So one of the big concerns I think you could have is that the folks who are getting these other disciplinary infractions are doing like piddly little things that are like annoying but not serious, and the folks who are ending up in solitary confinement are doing like big bad things that are more than just annoying. They're actually dangerous either to themselves or other folks in the facility. And so one of the things that we've found pretty encouraging, it's even too small to see on this screen, is that so folks who end up in solitary almost exclusively end up in there for possessing drugs or weapons, almost always drugs. The proportion of folks in Denmark who are possessing weapons is really low. Possessing illegal goods, which pretty much means cell phones, like that is the only thing that essentially falls in that category, or violating facility-specific rules, which basically just means being impossible to control, as far as I've been able to get from guards and from wardens, that it's just sort of consistently being really difficult. And so about 75% of the folks who end up in solitary confinement end up in for those three offenses that I think folks in the prison facilities, but also folks more broadly, would think of as being relatively minor. So folks who end up in for other sanctions, about 20% of them end up being in for possessing drugs or weapons, almost always drugs. 35% end up in for having cell phones, and 18% end up in for violating facility-specific rules. And so, at least in terms of the offenses that land folks in solitary, it actually looks like they're very, very similar. Now, one of the things that we've done as a robustness check is to try to limit the analysis to those specific types of infractions, and we found results that are substantively similar. Yeah?
The column for solitary says percentage of all infractions. Oh, I see. No, never mind.
I mean, I'm just amazed that you can read that. I'm jealous. So it's just the percentage of all infractions. So about 16% of total infractions.
Solitary.
Yep, result in solitary, and 84% result in some other sort of disciplinary sanction. Okay, things that we can see now. So this is just sort of how large the descriptive difference is in the cumulative probability of being convicted for a new crime and in cumulative earnings over this period. So you see that just descriptively there are very large differences between folks who end up in solitary, folks who just end up with other disciplinary infractions, and folks who don't essentially experience any sanctions while they're incarcerated. So what we're going to do here, and I'm going to try to move through the results pretty quickly. So in these models, we're essentially looking at the effect of experiencing solitary confinement on the probability of being convicted of a new crime in the 3 years following release. And so I just want to draw your attention to the model that we think is the most rigorous. And so this last model is folks who experience solitary confinement relative to folks who experience some other sort of sanction for disciplinary infraction. So folks who have essentially had sort of some contact with the sanction process in the prison. And then we're also using propensity score matching. And what we see within that group is that folks who experience solitary confinement are about 6.7 percentage points more likely to be convicted in the 3 years following release than folks who only experienced other disciplinary infractions And so that's about a 15% difference in the cumulative probability of reincarceration. I imagine that not a lot of folks in this room are criminologists, but I mean, if you could tell a criminologist that anything that didn't have to do with prior conviction history would affect the probability of recidivism by 15%, they would absolutely want to change that. This is just a really, really huge effect in terms of what you'd expect to see in that literature. When we look at earnings instead, and here again we're going to focus on sort of the preferred model when talking about things. So being placed in solitary confinement relative to just experiencing some other disciplinary sanction leads to about a $1,200 decrease in cumulative earnings in the 3 years after release. So a substantial decrease, especially when you think about how low the baseline level of earnings is for these folks. Yeah.
So going from the regression to the propensity score matching,
Yep.
your sample size drops a lot.
Yep.
And so I assume that's because you're excluding things that are off the common support.
Mhm.
And if that's throwing out a lot of control variables, I mean, control cases, then great. But was it a lot of treated cases that are incomparable?
So this is an excellent question. So we only lose 3 treated cases. Everything else is control cases. I'm actually very glad that I looked at that footnote before coming here now, because that would have been even more embarrassing than the tiny font. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So that's been one of the things that we've been pretty encouraged about, is that each step here, we're losing cases that we're not interested in, that we're not thinking of as being truly comparable, but we're still retaining sort of all the folks who experience solitary, so it's improving. Yeah?
But didn't you say some crimes were sentenced to be solitary in the beginning? And for those crimes, I don't know, maybe rape, maybe murder, then they have 0 probability being the other group in the control.
Yep.
So you do have no support cases for them.
So I must have botched when I was saying that earlier. It's only in the U.S. context that folks would end up in sort of solitary confinement as a condition of their sentence. The only folks who would experience that in the Danish context don't actually technically get counted as being in the prison system, because they're in the hospital for sort of the criminally insane, basically. But yeah, that would be, I mean, when we think about extending this to some of the data we have from Pennsylvania, that's going to be a core issue, is that probably about 3/4 of the folks who experience solitary confinement in the time window we have in Pennsylvania will be folks who experience it as a part of their sentence. And so there's not actually a true comparison group for them. But in Denmark, we're okay with that. Yeah.
Being a day and being
This is going to go poorly for me, isn't it? I should have noticed you're so sharply dressed. The Danes always make me look even more ridiculous than I make myself look. I'm ready.
One part is being a day, the other part is working with registered market data last 15 years.
Sure.
So what I know is those things are the formal part of it.
Yep.
Then you have informal economic activity,
Yeah.
and those things you register.
Right.
The bail. And so
Yeah.
how do you get there?
Yeah, no, it's true. So if I can generate an additional critique for you, I mean, the other thing is that we're only measuring official criminal justice contact, right? We're not actually gauging criminal activity after release, which is theoretically what we should be interested in. I mean, I think the way that we've made ourselves feel better about these results, because that is a serious issue, is to focus in some supplementary analyses instead on pro-social adjustment that folks can be making to the labor market. So we've been looking at sort of the number of weeks worked in sort of the formal sector that's registering wages. We've also looked at educational take-up after release. And so the way we've tried to deal with that concern is by essentially flipping it toward something sort of more positive in terms of people's life course trajectories. But yeah, it's totally, it's very, very tricky that we're missing sort of the gray economy kind of wages. And I mean, I hate to open up a whole can of worms here, but it's especially tricky in Copenhagen, right? So the results are, look basically the same in Copenhagen, but with what we know about sort of the gray labor market there, it's more concerning. Yeah?
It's just that I work with rough conditions.
Yeah.
So they are expert in gray economy and informal economic activities, and they have a survey. So
Yeah.
maybe these two could be combined.
Yeah.
That
No.
could be a possibility.
Yeah.
Adjusted.
Yeah. No, that's a great idea. That's a great idea. Because even if it doesn't affect their total earnings at all, but it's leading to an increase in their gray market earnings and a decrease in their, I don't know what not gray market earnings are supposed to be called. I'm not good at stuff like that. I have so many economists around that I feel like anything that involving that I've just unlearned. But yeah, no, that would be an interesting way to go forward. So it's funny, my co-author there, I do most of the writing and most of the laying out of the papers. So he just sees me as this annoying person who asks him to go do additional stuff. So I will make sure that I said this came from the Dane, not from me directly. Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned the control for sort of mental health care contact prior to
Yeah.
solitary confinement, but I'm wondering in terms of organizational practices. So say if you receive a sanction versus are placed in solitary confinement, say if you're placed in solitary confinement, the sort of prison has a practice of being oh wow, this person doesn't yet have a mental health care diagnosis, but we ought to get them some help because clearly they're acting out for some reason. They receive a diagnosis with higher probability than someone not, and then that diagnosis leads to sort of self-stigma that then later affects these later outcomes. So I guess I'm just wondering what other processes are activated by a placement in solitary confinement as opposed to that, and how might that affect through not actual mental health, but being labeled and the stigmatized process.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, so the two responses I have are first, that in general, Danish prisons are much, much, much more interested in getting other types of services involved with inmates than U.S. correctional facilities are. And so, my impression is that being placed in solitary confinement would have a smaller effect on the probability of receiving a diagnosis contingent upon levels of mental health being really similar than it would in the U.S. context. In the U.S. context, I absolutely think that could be the case. The other thing, and I know we have Dane here, you can correct me, but my impression has always been that formal interaction with the mental health system is less stigmatized in Denmark than it is in the States. Eh? Oh no, there are two of you? Okay. They're totally different countries. Why are you looking at it? Okay, but so I do think that's I think that's something that's probably not driving the process in Denmark. I do think that in the U.S. there are just a whole series of additional complications that are missing in the Danish context. So these are great questions. I always think it's funny. Whenever I give presentations, I am bored of the results by that point, so I never really want to talk about them. But then I realize that that's what is interesting to all of us as people who like data. So it's nice having more questions toward the end. So the other thing I want to show you sort of relatively briefly is that we've also broken this down by the number of consecutive days that somebody was in solitary confinement, and that's driven in large part by this literature that suggests that either over 24 consecutive hours or over a week is where you really start to see this serious sort of devolution in terms of mental health. And so here you do see larger effects for 3 to 7 days and 7+ days in terms of the cumulative probability of experiencing a conviction. And you don't really see much difference at all for earnings until you hit this sort of, until you hit this higher, ooh, bless you, until you hit sort of 7 or more days. One of the things that we've been encouraged by in terms of, so there could be sort of a couple different ways that solitary could be working. One could be that people are going through for a bunch of really short stints. So like somebody who did 10 total days in solitary confinement for 10 different infractions over the course of the period. And at least when you look at the mental health literature, we shouldn't expect that there would be really large effects there. But then there could be folks who are in for 1 10 consecutive day spell. And when we've tried to tear that apart to the degree that we can in the data, it does look like the effects are more concentrated among these longer term sort of stints rather than like a large number of short ones.
Yeah, just curious, how much uncertainty is there for prisoners going into solitary confinement? Because I can imagine like going in and having no idea when you're going to be let out can have more deleterious consequences than otherwise, and if there's differences between Denmark and the U.S. in terms of that.
Yeah, so this is a great question. In Denmark, it's very clear how long you're going to be in, and it's not going to be super duper long. But Danes also use punishment cells, so disciplinary segregation, much more than we do in the U.S. And in the U.S., we're more likely to put folks into administrative segregation. And in administrative segregation, they can keep you there as long as the danger that you pose or that's posed to you continues to exist in the mind of the warden, which is to say however long they want. And so I would expect that the sort of psychological consequences of administrative segregation, having this sort of unclear date of release, would actually be a good bit larger. But in the Danish context, it's almost all punishment cell confinement. Yeah, Tom.
So these are a really interesting set of results where you've broken down a number of consecutive
Sure.
days in solitary confinement.
Yeah.
Descriptively, right? On the descriptive tables in the beginning of the talk,
Yep.
you showed a number of kind of pre-incarceration characteristics, right? Mental health.
Yep.
How does that vary among individuals kind of broken down along these categories, right? Because you're trying to make a...
Yep, that is a great question. So the big differences are between folks who never have an infraction and folks who ever have an infraction. Contingent upon having an infraction, the differences between that and solitary are pretty small. And then once you limit it to the folks who end up in solitary ever, the differences in terms of the background characteristics are pretty small. I think in the US context that would likely not be the case. And so again, I think it's one of those things that pushing forward, especially with administrative data in the US, would be a big issue. This is a great question. Okay, so it looks like solitary confinement has negative long-term consequences for recidivism and for earnings, but these aren't necessarily sort of causal estimates, although I do think we have a strong research design relative to previous research, and it's Denmark rather than the United States, which I have to say, like, the more and more I work in Denmark, the less and less I care about, which I'm not sure is a good thing, that bothers me less over time. So I did want to talk about sort of 2 next steps that we've been thinking about very briefly, and then hopefully have a couple minutes for questions. So we can do the conviction part of this using data that we have on all, ooh, bless you, Tom, based on all folks who have been in prison in Pennsylvania since 1990. So we can actually run sort of a very similar design. Again, we've been trying to get we could actually do something with wardens, potentially, with the PA data, because we'd have enough turnover, but we've been trying to get guards who are assigned to blocks, and they just get very angry when we bring it up at this point, which is frustrating. The other thing that we've been trying to think about is the like broader sort of spillover effects of solitary confinement on sort of families especially. And we've been trying to think about that because when we think about the conditions of confinement, and this is a huge problem with the mass incarceration literature, we tend to think about them very little, and at most for the individual who's directly experiencing those conditions of confinement. But there are a whole bunch of good reasons to expect that if these conditions of confinement have large effects on the folks who are exposed to them, that those effects would sort of spill out more broadly. So anyway, this is fun. Thanks for talking to me.